Hey everyone, thanks for coming to our YouTube channel and checking out Reunion. Reunion's mission is helping people find their way back to God. And we believe that finding your way back to God is not a destination, but a relationship. No matter whether you feel like you're far from God or you've been following Jesus for many years, we are all daily finding our way back to God. And today we are continuing our series called Live No Lies. We began this series by acknowledging that there's a war happening in our souls. And Jesus names one of the enemies of our souls, a force of evil in the world today, as the devil. And the devil's primary means of combat are not weapons of destruction, but lies. And these lies are highly effective. But why? In just a moment, we're going to explore the idea of the flesh, where we have these disordered desires that move us away from reality and truth. But before we get to Nathan, let me share a little bit about Reunion and how you can get connected with us. If you are in the Boston area and looking for a community to explore faith with, we invite you to participate in Somerville and Davis Square. We would love to meet you. You can also find all the details on our website, reunionboston.com. If you have your phone handy, also feel free to scan the QR code using your camera, and it will take you directly to our connection card. Fill out the card and we'll reach out to answer any questions you might have about faith or how you can be a part of our community. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram. Now here's Nathan as he shares with us.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nathan, and I am grateful to be with all of you today. A few days ago, I was at the grocery store with my family, and we just had this quick trip to make to grab a couple things, but we're kind of like just checking in at the end, getting ready to go to the register, making sure we had everything. And Emily asked me if there was anything else that we needed or that I wanted. And I kind of laughed and I told her, yeah, actually, I really want some peanut butter chocolate ice cream, but I knew I probably shouldn't have any since rumor has it that that's bad for you. And Emily kind of laughed and she basically was like, same. So we didn't think much of it. We started walking to the store, to the front of the store to check out. And Emily remembers there's like one more thing that we need to grab. So she takes the cart and the kids and goes to get whatever it is, and I just disappear. And it was the wildest thing. I blacked out. No idea what happened. But the next thing I know, I'm back at our cart and I'm holding a tub of peanut butter chocolate ice cream. It was just the craziest thing. So Emily laughs and is like, I thought we weren't going to get that, And I was just like, hey, the heart wants what the heart wants, right? The heart wants what it wants. I'm sure many of us have said that before, but probably most of us don't know where that phrase actually came from. Well, in 1992, the journalist Walter Isaacson was interviewing Woody Allen for Time magazine. And the subject was Allen's notorious affair with Soon-Yi Previn. Now, there's some debate as to what actually happened, but the basic story goes something like this. All throughout the 1980s, Allen was in an on-again, off-again relationship with Mia Farrow, an actress and a model. Before she and Allen had begun dating, her and her then-husband had adopted 2 children from Vietnam, and then after that, a 7-year-old girl from South Korea, a girl named Soon-Yi. After a few years, Farrow then adopted 2 more children. Then she and Allen had a son together. They were quite the family. I mean, they were all over the tabloids in New York and LA. And years went by, and eventually Farrow and Allen's relationship began to deteriorate. Now, one day, she found photos of her daughter, Soon-Yi, in the nude. And she found them on Allen's fireplace mantle. And that was the moment where the truth came out. Allen and Soon-Yi had been having an affair. Allen at the time was 56, and Soon-Yi was 21. And to make sure that this isn't lost on us, Allen had been dating her mom for years and was essentially her functional stepdad. But Allen went on to date and eventually marry Soon-Yi, right? And so Isaac's interview of Allen reads like a case study in postmodern ethics. Isaacson, who's one of the best interviewers of our day, is calmly but persistently probing Alan's heart for some kind of regret or apology or even just moral uncertainty. But Alan simply refused to admit that he'd done anything wrong. And at the very end of the interview, Isaacson asked why he did it. And Alan paused and then tendered his iconic line, "The heart wants what it wants." This off-the-cuff saying has entered not only into the vernacular, but also the belief system of our generation. It's become a kind of self-perpetuating justification for almost anything, from adultery to chocolate peanut butter ice cream. It's this kind of get out of jail free card for any behavior that falls outside the lines of moral tradition. Yet, very few people realize the origin story of the saying. And I would guess that you would be hard pressed to find someone who approved of its first usage, someone who would justify an affair between a college girl and a man more than twice her age, much less the sexual escapade where a dad becomes a brother-in-law and a sister becomes a stepmom. And yet, that's the story. And that is the saying that has guided so much of our cultural perception and acceptable norms. I mean, how did we get there? How did we get to the heart wanting what the heart wants being one of the primary motivators for how we make decisions and how we decide as a whole what is acceptable? The philosopher Charles Taylor, in his seminal work, A Secular Age, wrote about how the West changed from a culture of authority to a culture of authenticity, meaning we used to live by what external authority structures like God or the Bible or tradition, things like that, what they told us to do. But now most Western people live from what their internal or their authentic self wants to do. And the tipping point seemed to be Freud. Now, I'm not a psychologist. I want to make sure I make that clear. I took one psychology class in college, and even though I crushed a B+ in that class, I don't know if that makes me an expert on the subject. But from what I've read in prepping for this talk, it seems that most psychologists seem to agree that, savant that he was, Freud got pretty much everything wrong. And yet many of his ideas created the cultural air that we now breathe. See, prior to Freud, most of the people in the West, whether they knew it or not, thought about desire through the lens of the 4th century philosopher Augustine. St. Augustine was actually a North African, but his ideas, while developed on African soil, gave shape to much of the Western civilization for over millennia. See, according to Augustine, the basic problem of the human condition is that of disordered desires or disordered loves. In his view, human beings were created in love and created for love. So he viewed humans as being lovers first and thinkers second, that humans primarily lived from desire and not out of rational minds. So in the Augustinian view, the problem of the human condition isn't that we don't love. Actually, it's that we love the wrong thing, or that we love the right things, but we love them in the wrong order. For example, it's not bad to love your job. I hope you do. I hope you like going to work. But if you love your career more than you love your child, that's a disordered desire, and it's going to create major problems for both you and your kid. Or it's not even bad to love your children. You should. I do most of the time. But if you love your kids more than you love God, that's disordered, and that will deform how you relate to both. Or maybe we could look at this from a more cultural lens. It's not bad for you to love sex. God himself created us as sexual beings and commanded us to increase in number. But when sex becomes kind of the pseudo God, a place we look to for identity or belonging or satisfaction, then it becomes a disordered love. And it's not just that it's wrong in the moral sense. It's that it cannot possibly satisfy the deeper ache of the soul, the deeper ache for love, intimacy, acceptance. See, the body might say it wants one thing, but the soul is longing for something more. So in the pre-Freud West, human flourishing was not about saying yes to the right desire. Or excuse me, it was about saying yes to the right desires. It was about saying yes to the higher desires of love and being able to say no to the lower desires, the more kind of base appetite kind of desires. And we would navigate our desires by the mental maps that were handed down to us by a trusted but external authority, ideally handed down from Jesus himself as these teachings came to us through the New Testament. But Freud's take was radically contrary. See, for him, our most important desire was our libido, which he defined as our desire, not just for sex, but kind of for pleasure as a whole. But because libido without restraint would lead to anarchy, our parents and cultural structures forced us to repress our desires. And for Freud, and this is key, repression of desires is the basis for all neurosis. Kind of the translation of that is that the reason you're unhappy is because other people are telling you you can't do stuff. I mean, I think most of us can probably take a guess as to which view won the fight for the West's view of reality. We see it still in slogans all over our culture today. The heart wants what it wants, right? Or just follow your heart. I mean, you do you. And speak your truth. And of course, be true to yourself. Does anyone remember Shakespeare from like 9th or 10th grade? Shakespeare in one of his plays had this quote, "This above all, to thine own self be true." It's a quote from the play Hamlet. And I would guess most of us probably don't remember 10th grade Shakespeare. I don't, for sure. I had to look up who actually said this line. But if you don't remember, the line was said by Polonius, the fool. It's the fool who encourages us to live by the slogan, be true to yourself. And yet, probably many of us have heard this or maybe even said this mantra like it's gospel. We just assume, and remember, ideas are assumptions about reality. We assume that the way to be happy, the way to have a flourishing life, is to follow our hearts. And we often misunderstand that to be any kind of authentic desire. See, happiness has become about feeling good, not being good. The good life has become about getting what we want, not becoming the kind of people who truly want good things. But if this is supposed to make us happy, why does it so often do the opposite? If this is supposed to make us happy, why, even after the heart gets what it wants, do we often feel so frustrated and angry and sad and broken? When we give the heart what the heart wants, why do we often end up feeling worse? Not like our lives are better or that we are flourishing as people. See, this past month, we've been in the middle of a teaching series called Live No Lies. And throughout this series, we've been walking towards a way of living that helps us win the battle for our souls. A quick recap of where we've been. We talked about how there is a war that's happening, but it's happening within us. A war that's going on for our souls. And one of the enemies of our souls is what Jesus calls the devil, an active force of evil and destruction that's creating havoc in our world and in our lives today. The devil doesn't attack us with weapons, though. Rather, it attacks us with lies, false beliefs that get us to reframe our minds and shift how we live our lives. But last week, we talked about this idea that we can actually talk back to the devil's lies. We don't have to listen to them. We can use scripture to refute them, just like we saw Jesus do. But today, we need to ask a different question. See, if we know that the devil is speaking lies to us, why do we so often believe them? See, I'm not one, to give out my social security number to everyone who emails me and asks for it. And the main reason I don't do that is because I know pretty much all those emails are scams. Or in other words, they're lies. So I know to say no to them. I know not to fall for them. But so often, even though we know the devil is trying to lie to us, we do fall for it. Why is that? I mean, could it be because the devil often plays into what Alan said? The heart wants what it wants. What if we were following in the footsteps of Freud? What if our hearts were craving the wrong things? To see what Alan called the heart, most New Testament authors and scholars actually referred to as the flesh. The word flesh shows up many times throughout the New Testament, and it's this Greek word sarx. Now, like many English words, sarx has multiple meanings. Like, think of the English word squash. It can mean a vegetable. It's pretty tasty, especially in its zucchini form. It can be a game that you play like racquetball, or a game that you play that's like racquetball, excuse me. But actually, to be fair, it's probably a lot more confusing than racquetball. Or it can be used like a verb, like to squash a bug. So in the same way, sarx has three different meanings. Flesh can simply mean our body, like it does in 1 Corinthians 6:16 or 1 Peter 1:24. Or flesh can be referring to our ethnicity, like it does in Philippians 3:3. But there's actually a third meaning, what we talk about when we're talking about flesh today. It's what Paul wrote about in Ephesians 2, verse 3, when he said, gratifying the cravings of our flesh. See, here he means our animalistic cravings, the cravings of our body apart from God. And Paul further defined it in Romans 7:5, where he wrote, for while we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions. In fact, it's interesting. In the original New International Version translation of the Bible, scholars consistently translated sarx as sinful nature. And I didn't go over well with some theologians. So in the updated version that we've had from I think 2011, it was changed back to kind of this older translation of the word flesh. But to be fair, the biblical linguists and translators were just attempting to communicate this third sense of this Greek word, the sinful appetite in all of us that feels natural to our bodies and yet we know is wrong. And after all, each of us is more than just a body. We're also a soul. The pastor and scholar Eugene Peterson defined flesh as the corruption that sin has introduced into our very appetites and instincts. See, what we're defining here is our base, primal, animalistic drive for self-gratification, especially pertaining to pleasure in general, as well as our instincts for survival and domination and the need for control. These are desires that are in all of us. In spite of the humanistic atmosphere all around us constantly telling us we're good, we all know that we have these desires. We don't know what to do with them because they don't match the cultural message we hear all the time. And because of that, we so often feel terrified that the truth will come out, or that we'll feel shame all over our inner lives, or even this kind of self-hate. But the New Testament is incredibly open about the dark underbelly of the human heart, the part of us that we want to keep hidden, and yet we can't seem to shake. And while this language of flesh is kind of unique to Paul and early Christian theologians, this idea is not really a specific Christian one. It's an ancient and cross-cultural insight into the problem of the human condition. You know, this idea is mentioned by Buddha, by Plato, by early rabbis, more recently by the transcendentalist Henry David Thoreau, the psychologist Jonathan Haidt, and even Joe Rogan and Elon Musk joking on a podcast about how humans are all chimps and chimps do terrible, nasty things to each other. See, the point is, for a very long time, Humans of the more self-aware variety from across ethnic, religious, and generational lines have been conscious of a hierarchy of desire within our minds and our bodies. Not all desires are created equal, or at least not all of them are equally beneficial. Some of our desires are higher or nobler, and they lead us to life and freedom and peace, but others are lower or more animalistic. These are the desires the devil plays into. The desires we often build these lies upon. The cravings of the flesh that we cannot seem to rid ourselves of. The question then becomes, what happens when we do build our lives on these desires of the flesh? And maybe some of us are even asking, does it really matter? For that, we go back to Paul. And because Paul addresses where these cravings of our flesh lead us to in the letter that he wrote to the church in Galatia. We'll pick up in Galatians 5:13, where we read this. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. You are called to be free. But just because we have this freedom doesn't mean that we should use that freedom to give in to our disordered desires. See, Paul uses the word freedom here in this kind of standard philosophical sense of self-determination. Philosophers argue that human beings are the only creatures with self-determining freedom. See, unlike animals, we don't just run off our primal evolutionary drives for pleasure and survival. We have those drives, but we also have self-determining freedom. We have the capacity to override those drives when they are disordered. So Paul is essentially confirming what we've already talked about, that we have within us this freedom in how we're going to choose to live. Are we going to give into the desires of our flesh, the disordered desires within us, the animalistic cravings for more that we think will make us happy? So we have the freedom to do that. We can decide whether or not we want to use our freedom to gossip or to lie or to create injustice or to do a subtle reorg of our company and inch our way up the corporate ladder. See, freedom is very easy to abuse. And when we abuse freedom, we negate love. I mean, notice Paul's next line. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. If you bite and devour each other, watch out or you will be destroyed by each other. See, for Paul, the opposite of indulge in the flesh is actually love your neighbor. To indulge in the flesh is to live a life that is anti-love. The flesh runs off our animal drive for self-gratification and survival, which, as Dr. Schwartz of UCLA accurately observed, makes us perceive fellow sentient, suffering beings as nothing more than objects of or obstacles to your desires. Meaning, when we are giving into our flesh, we are out of love. We see others as objects and we think only of ourselves. Augustine called this sin, living for the flesh. He called it love turned in on itself. And likely playing with that idea, Martin Luther later called one who lived for one's own pleasure and sensual gratification homo incurvatius in se, which is translated as man curved in upon himself. And Paul's thought gets at this next idea as well. So I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want. But whatever we want is exactly what we're told to do. In fact, it's often the lie the devil tells us to do. See, the problem is that just because something feels good doesn't mean it is good. And if there's anything we actually should not do, it's probably whatever we want. See, Paul goes on to name these acts of the flesh, these whatever we want desires, these things that we find ourselves craving and pursuing. Paul writes this: the acts of the flesh are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity and debauchery, idolatry and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions and envy, drunkenness and orgies and the like. I warn you, as I did before, that those who live like this will not inherit the kingdom of God. I mean, I would guess much of this probably sounds familiar to us: sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery, or Tinder, hookup culture, a lot of the kind of local bar and club scenes, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, Twitter, cancel culture, and most of the news that we consume, selfish ambition, dissension, factions, politics, from office gossip to Washington, D.C., envy, the internet, the mall, advertising, and the ever great envy generator that is Instagram. Drunkenness, orgies, and the like, Netflix, HBO, the rise of addiction, so much more. This is not just like a plea to say delete your Instagram or cancel your HBO Max subscriptions. But when we look around, it's not a far stretch for us to see that the things that we often grasp for in our culture, the things that our culture seems to idolize or fantasize about, the things we're told to do because we can do whatever we want, they aren't leading us to flourishing. A lot of ways they're killing us. We could tell countless stories of how these things have destroyed people in our lives. Many of us could probably tell stories about how we've had moments where we've lived into these things and they've damaged us in ways we can't imagine. They maybe have damaged those around us. See, it seems as though the devil plays into these lies because the cravings of our flesh promise to give us exactly what we want. But when we end up living into them, we don't actually find flourishing at the ends. The cravings of our flesh might feel good for a moment, but they lead to our destruction. And oftentimes, they don't just lead to our destruction, but a deep pain for those around us. We end up using others to get what we want, and we usually find that we aren't any happier for it. Instead, we've just pushed others away, and we've become more lonely and isolated and broken. But Paul's point is that we doesn't have to be this way, that we have a freedom to choose what we are going to give ourselves to. And what we give ourselves to will shape the trajectory of our souls, of our life, of our society, or at least those closely connected to us. We can continue to choose to give ourselves to the lies of the devil, to give into our flesh for a fleeting moment of pleasure, or we can choose to live a different way, to walk another path, to give ourselves to what Paul calls the fruits of the Spirit. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things, there is no law. I mean, this might sound like a pipe dream to many of us, but according to Paul, this is actually the type of person that we can become when we choose to live out of the flesh and live into the Spirit. We can be people who are loving and joyful and unanxious and unhurried and helpful, deeply good souls. In other words, people who pursue the way of Jesus, empowered by the Spirit of Jesus, which we receive when we believe in his life, death, and resurrection. They have the power to experience true freedom. Not a negative freedom that we often think of when we think of freedom, but a true positive freedom. Negative freedom, I think, is best exemplified in the following kind of poetic masterpiece from the great Scandinavian intellectual, Princess Elsa. Yeah, the one from Frozen, who sang with all her heart, no right, no wrong, no rules for me. I'm free. I mean, come on. Who else did you think I was going to quote, right? But this view of freedom arises out of a postmodern worldview that has no belief in moral absolutes or any ultimate meaning to life beyond personal happiness. In this view, the opposite of freedom is constraint. Whether it comes from an external authority source, a sacred text like the Bible, or a binding commitment like marriage or parenting. Freedom, in this take, is the liberation to do, honestly, whatever the hell we want. And I use that language deliberately because that is usually where we find ourselves at the end of this thinking. A life that we thought was freedom, that we find to be a prison, a hell on earth for ourselves. But that's not Paul's view of freedom, and that's not Jesus's view of freedom. It's not most luminaries of the human condition prior to the modern era's view of freedom. They put more emphasis on positive freedom. Freedom not just to choose, but to choose good. For them, freedom isn't about autonomy from authority, but about liberating, loving relationships from sin. And positive freedom means we need a kind of power outside of ourselves to overcome our strong desires for self-gratification and to fulfill our deep desire for self-giving love. We need a God who would freely give himself for us so that we can have freedom to give ourselves to others, only to find that we've found freedom for ourselves at the end of giving ourselves. I mean, look at how Paul started this whole section of his letter. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. The death and the resurrection of Jesus set us free, but not just a freedom to do whatever we want. Jesus offers us a greater freedom than that. It's a freedom from the power of sin and the power of our flesh over us. Because ultimately, one day when sin is no more, we'll realize that in full fruition. But even today, as we begin to crucify our flesh here in the now, we can start to experience that freedom. See, Paul closes this section of this letter by saying this: those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. The crucifixion of Jesus gives us the power to crucify our flesh. It began a victory over the flesh that cannot be stopped. It offered us a freedom, a true freedom, a freedom to actually live into the ways of the Spirit. At the end of that, we'll see that that is where we find flourishing. The devil's lies appeal to us because they make promises to our flesh. They offer us a quick hit of dopamine, and we think that will make us happy. Dopamine, this chemical that's released in our body, is often called the pleasure chemical. It can kind of truly act like a drug. It gives us this quick boost, but the thing about dopamine is that it doesn't last. And it's kind of ironic because often when we participate in acts of service and acts of love towards others, we're living into things that release a chemical into our bodies called serotonin. That's the happiness chemical. And unlike dopamine, it doesn't give us this massive rush, immediate kind of emotional boost. But what it does give us is a more low-level, long-lasting, sustainable boost and release of happiness. See, the lies of the devil might want to offer us a quick hit of pleasure. Pleasure often leads to a way of addiction, a way of looking for our next hit of pleasure so that we could maybe someday eventually be happy. But addiction, deep down, is a form of slavery. Addiction is often defined as a kind of prolonged suicide by pleasure. But the truth of Jesus wants to offer us joy, a way of living that leads to true freedom. But learning to love and follow the right master is what's going to get us that freedom. Following one who wants to bring about good for us, a God who wants to bring good for everyone around us, a master who is willing to die so that goodness could be known for all eternity. And we get to decide which part to feed, the flesh or the spirit. And we also get to decide which part to crucify, the flesh or the spirit. The truth is, our choice has the power to change everything for us. Thank you so much for watching. Let me hand things back over to Matt.
Let's close with our benediction. Great and mighty God, it is good for us to be humbled by your greatness. We are nothing when compared to who you are. Though we are weak and overwhelmed by flesh, your grace enables us to become more like you. In our sin and failure, have mercy on us, O God. May we remember the mighty one, Jesus Christ, who stands between us and makes a way for us to be redeemed. His blood is our peace, his righteousness our strength, his condemnation our freedom, his spirit our power, his kingdom our heritage. Lord, let us know your grace, feeling its strength. By your grace, overcome our evil natures, set us apart from sin's entrapments, and support us in life's trials. Father, we ask that these things would happen by the power of your Spirit and the blood of your Son, our God and community, holy and one. Amen. Go in peace and live the church.